The rain had been falling over Millbrook County Medical Center since before sunrise, the kind of steady October rain that made the old radiators knock and hum, that made everyone in scrubs move just a little slower, a little heavier, as if the weight of the sky had settled into their shoulders too. Margaret Ellison had worked the trauma floor for 11 years. She was 52 years old, with silver threading through her dark ponytail now, and hands that had learned long ago not to shake, not even when everything around her was falling apart. She liked to say that nursing wasn't a job you chose. It was a job that chose you, the way a river chooses its path, carving through whatever stood in its way, patient and unstoppable. Her mother had been a nurse. Her grandmother had rolled bandages in a canvas tent during the Second World War, somewhere in France, though she never spoke much about it, not even at the end. Margaret used to sit at her grandmother's kitchen table as a little girl, watching her hands, spotted with age, steady as a surgeon's, as she rolled dough for biscuits every Sunday morning. "The hands remember what the heart decides," her grandmother used to say. "Decide to help, and the hands will find a way." Margaret had never forgotten that. It was just past 2 in the afternoon when the call came through. Not the usual call, not a car accident, not a heart attack, not the ordinary rhythm of small-town emergencies that Millbrook County was built to handle. This was different. This was 6 men, military, special operations, though nobody said the words out loud at first, injured in what the radio dispatcher only called a training incident, 30 miles out, near the old airfield, the Navy. Sometimes used for exercises, nobody in town asked too many questions about 6 men, all critical, all coming in at once. The chief of surgery, a tall, silver-haired man named Dr. Whitfield Pierce, stood in the middle of the emergency bay barking orders like a general marshalling troops for battle. Pierce had been at Millbrook for 22 years. He wore his authority the way some men wear cologne, a little too much of it, applied a little too liberally, so that everyone around him could smell it coming before he ever said a word. He did not know Margaret's name. Not really. He knew her as the nurse with the ponytail, or on bad days simply, "You there." When the ambulances began pulling in, one after another, lights washing red and blue across the wet pavement, Pierce turned to the assembled staff and began dividing them up like a man dealing cards. "Ellison," he said, glancing at her only briefly, "Prep Bay 4. You'll be assisting, not leading. I don't have time to explain triage philosophy to a floor nurse today." Margaret didn't answer him with words. She simply nodded and went to work, the way she always did, because arguing with a man like Pierce in the middle of a crisis was like arguing with a thunderstorm. You didn't win. You simply moved through it and did what needed doing. The first man they wheeled in was young that couldn't have been more than 26, with a jaw clenched so tight against the pain that Margaret could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, shrapnel wound deep along his thigh, blood loss significant. His name, stitched onto a strip of fabric on his uniform, read simply, Garcia. The second was older, maybe 35, with a crushed hand and a head wound that had bled through 3 layers of gauze already. Rodriguez. Then came Hollis, then Baker, then Chen. Then, last of all, carried in on a stretcher with a stillness that worried Margaret more than any amount of screaming would have. A broad-shouldered man named Thorne, barely conscious, his blood pressure dropping with every passing minute. 6 men, 6 lives balanced on a thread that seemed to grow thinner by the second. Pierce moved between them like a conductor trying to lead 6 different orchestras at once, and Margaret watched, really watched, the way her grandmother had taught her to watch, not just with her eyes, but with something deeper. And she understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that Pierce was making a mistake. He was treating them in the order they'd arrived. Garcia first, because Garcia had come through the doors first. But Garcia's wound, though painful, was not the most urgent. Thorne, quiet, still, fading, was running out of time in a way the others were not. "Dr. Pierce," Margaret said, her voice calm, the way she always kept it calm, because panic never saved a single life in the history of medicine. "Thorne needs to go first. His pressure's dropping too fast. If we don't get him into surgery in the next 10 minutes... "I said I'd handle the philosophy, Ellison." Pierce didn't even turn around. "Prep Bay 4 like I asked." There was a long pause. The kind of pause that later Margaret would think of as the hinge on which the whole afternoon turned. She could have stepped back. She could have gone to Bay 4 exactly as instructed and let the day unfold the way Pierce intended it to unfold. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have even noticed. But her grandmother's voice was in her ear now, soft as flower dust in Sunday morning light. "The hands remember what the heart decides." "With respect, sir," Margaret said, and something in her tone made even the younger nurses nearby go quiet. "If we don't move Thorne to surgery right now, he won't survive long enough for you to get to him at all." Pierce turned then, finally, his face reddening with the particular fury of a man unused to being questioned by anyone, let alone a nurse he'd never bothered to learn the first name of. "Do you have a medical degree I don't know about, Ellison?" "No, sir." "Then step aside and let the doctors handle this." There was a soft, strained silence in the trauma bay, the kind of silence where machines beep and IV lines drip, and 6 wounded men lie waiting, and everyone standing upright is holding their breath without quite realizing it. And then a voice, rough, weak, but clear enough to cut through the tension like a blade, came from the stretcher where Thorne lay. "Let her," he managed, each word costing him visibly. "Let her." "Look at me." Pierce's jaw tightened. But even a man like Pierce, for all his bluster, understood the particular authority carried in the voice of a wounded soldier. He stepped back just slightly, just enough. "Fine," he said. "But if this goes wrong, Ellison, it's on you." "It already was," Margaret said quietly, and moved to Thorne's side. What Margaret Ellison knew, what 11 years on the trauma floor, and a childhood spent at her grandmother's elbow, and a lifetime of paying close attention to the things other people rushed past, had taught her was this: the body tells you the truth before the charts do, if you're willing to listen. She pressed 2 fingers gently to Thorne's wrist, feeling the thread of his pulse. Faster than it should be, weaker than it should be. She checked his color, gray beneath the tan of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. She lifted the edge of the field dressing on his abdomen and saw immediately what the ambulance crew in their rush had missed: an internal bleed, not visible from the outside, hidden beneath a wound that looked, on the surface, less severe than it was. "Internal hemorrhage," she said, loud enough now for the whole bay to hear. "He needs surgery immediately, not in 10 minutes, now." For one more moment, Pierce hesitated. Pride is a heavy thing to set down, even when a life hangs in the balance. But something in Margaret's voice, the calm, unshakable certainty of it, finally reached him. "Move him," Pierce said. "Now! Ellison, you're with me." What followed was 6 hours that Margaret would remember, in fragments and flashes for the rest of her life. She moved between the 6, men like her grandmother used to move, between rows of biscuit dough on a Sunday morning, efficient, unhurried despite the urgency, hands finding the work before her mind had even finished the thought. She assisted where Pierce needed assisting. She caught what he missed gently, without ever making him feel small for missing it, because that was never the point. The point was never to be right. The point was to keep 6 young men breathing until morning. Somewhere around hour 3, in the middle of closing a wound on Rodriguez's crushed hand, Pierce glanced over at her, really looked at her, the way he hadn't bothered to look at her in 11 years of working in the same building. "How did you know?" he asked. "About Thorne. How did you know before the charts even said it?" Margaret didn't look up from her work. Her hands kept moving, steady, sure. "My grandmother used to say the body speaks in a whisper before it screams," she said. "You just have to be quiet enough and humble enough to hear it." Pierce was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, the gray light through the window softening into something almost gentle. "I've been chief of surgery for 11 years, he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't think anyone's ever called me humble." "There's still time," Margaret said, and there was no bitterness in it. Only the plain, gentle honesty of a woman who had long ago stopped needing anyone's approval to know her own worth. By the time the sun set, a soft, apologetic sun, low and orange behind the thinning clouds, all 6 men were stable. Garcia would need weeks of physical therapy but would walk again fully, in time. Rodriguez's hand, though it would never look quite the same, would hold a coffee cup, a child's hand, a fishing rod, all the ordinary miracles of an ordinary life. Hollis, Baker, and Chen were resting quietly, their vitals steady, their worst hours behind them. And Thorne, who had spoken the only words that mattered in that entire chaotic afternoon, was in recovery. His internal bleeding stopped, his pulse strong and even, a man who would, by every measure that counted, go home to whatever family was waiting for him. Margaret sat alone for a moment in the small break room down the hall, a cup of vending machine coffee going cold in her hands, the kind of exhaustion settling into her that only comes after hours spent holding your entire self at attention for the sake of someone else's survival. The door opened. It was Pierce. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down across from her, in the plastic chair that wobbled slightly on the linoleum floor, and for a long moment the two of them just sat there, together in the particular silence that follows a day like the one they just lived through. "I owe you an apology," Pierce said finally. "More than one, probably. I've worked beside you for 11 years, and I don't think I ever once asked you a single question about yourself." Margaret smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. "You were busy being chief of surgery. That's not an excuse." He rubbed a hand over his face. "My father was a surgeon, too. He used to say the operating room was the great equalizer, that once you were under the lights, it didn't matter who you were outside of them, only what your hands could do. I think somewhere along the way I forgot that applies to everyone in the room, not just the ones with a scalpel. It's a hard thing to remember," Margaret said gently. "Pride has a way of making itself very comfortable if you let it." Pierce nodded slowly. Outside the window, the last of the rain clouds were breaking apart, letting through thin ribbons of that soft evening light that always seemed, to Margaret, like the sky's way of apologizing for the day. "Thorne asked to speak with the nurse who saved his life," Pierce said after a while, "before he goes into transport tomorrow. I told him I'd bring you by, if you're willing." Margaret found Thorne sitting up in his hospital bed the next morning, pale but alert, color returning slowly to his face like dawn returning color to a dark field. He was younger than she'd realized during the chaos of the day before, maybe 30, with the kind of quiet, watchful eyes that men who have seen difficult things often carry with them, long after the difficulty has passed. "Ma'am," he said as she came into the room, and there was something in the word, old-fashioned, respectful, the kind of word that made Margaret think of her own father, long gone now, who had always called women ma'am, whether they were 8 or 80. "I wanted to thank you properly. I understand I owe you my life." Margaret pulled a chair close to his bedside, the way she always did, because she believed, had always believed, that healing happened as much in conversation as it did in any operating room. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You just needed somebody willing to look a little closer, that's all. Most people can do that, if they slow down long enough." Thorne studied her for a moment. "Most people don't stand up to a man like Dr. Pierce either. Not in front of a whole room." Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking of her grandmother's hands rolling biscuit dough, thinking of 11 years of quiet, unremarked work on a trauma floor that had never once made her famous, or wealthy, or particularly noticed by anyone at all. "My grandmother used to tell me something," she said finally. She said, "Margaret, the world will spend a great deal of time trying to convince you that you're too small to matter. Don't you believe it? Every single life is a whole world, and every whole world deserves someone willing to fight for it." She smiled, a little wistfully. "I suppose I've spent my whole career trying to live up to that." Thorne nodded slowly, something in his tired eyes softening. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Margaret said. "She passed when I was 23, but I think about her every single day I put on these scrubs. I think she'd be glad to know some of what she taught me finally came in handy for 6 good men." "More than handy, ma'am," Thorne said quietly. "You gave us all a second chance at every ordinary thing waiting for us back home. My daughter turns 6 next month. I get to be there for that now, because of you." Margaret felt something warm rise in her chest. Not pride, exactly, though there was some of that too. but something gentler, something closer to gratitude. Gratitude for the strange, winding path that had brought her here, to this room at this moment, to be exactly the person one frightened young father needed her to be. "Go home to her," Margaret said softly. "Go home and hold her tight. And don't waste a single ordinary Tuesday taking it for granted. That's the only thanks I need." In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened in the trauma bay that October afternoon moved quietly through the halls of Millbrook County Medical Center, the way good stories always do. Not with fanfare, not with headlines, but in the soft, steady currency of one person telling another. Over coffee, over shift changes, over quiet moments in hallways. Dr. Pierce began slowly to change, not all at once. Because 11 years of pride doesn't dissolve overnight, but gradually, the way frost gives way to spring. He started asking the nurses their opinions before he made decisions, not after. He learned Margaret's first name properly, and then, in time, he learned the first names of nearly everyone on his floor, as if he'd been given a second chance of his own, and had decided finally not to waste it. Margaret never spoke much about that day, not because she wanted to hide it, but because that had never been her way. She simply went back to her rounds, her steady hands, her calm voice in the middle of chaos, doing the same quiet work she had always done. But sometimes on slow evenings, when the trauma floor had gone quiet and the machines hummed their gentle rhythms into the night, she would think of her grandmother's kitchen table, the smell of flour and Sunday morning sunlight, and the words that had guided her through every difficult hour of her career. The hands remember what the heart decides. She thought, too, of Garcia walking again, slowly but surely, at his physical therapy sessions, of Rodriguez holding his daughter's small hand with the fingers that had healed just enough, of Thorne, 6 months later, sending a photograph in the mail, no note, just a picture of a little girl blowing out 6 candles on a birthday cake, her father's arms wrapped around her, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. Margaret kept that photograph taped to the inside of her locker door, where she saw it every single morning before her shift began. Not as a reminder of what she had done. She was never one for taking credit, but as a reminder of why the work mattered in the first place. Why every ordinary Tuesday, every quiet, unremarkable shift, every moment of paying close attention when it would have been easier not to, added up in the end to something as simple and as enormous as a little girl getting to keep her father. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only comes with years, the kind that cannot be taught in classrooms, only lived into, slowly, the way a river carves its path through stone. Margaret had learned, over more than 5 decades of living, that the quietest people in the room are often the ones paying the closest attention. That kindness rarely announces itself with trumpets. It simply shows up again and again, in small, unremarkable moments, until one day those moments add up to something as large as a life saved or a family kept whole. She had learned, too, that it takes a particular kind of courage to speak a gentle truth to someone who does not want to hear it, not the loud courage of arguments won, but the quiet courage of simply refusing to look away from what needs doing, even when doing it is uncomfortable, even when doing it means standing your ground in a room full of people who outrank you. And she had learned, above all, that the people who laugh at you in the beginning are so rarely laughing by the end. That time and truth have a way of settling all accounts fairly if you are patient enough, and humble enough, and kind enough to simply keep doing the work in front of you. Margaret Ellison retired from Millbrook County Medical Center 8 years later. At the age of 60, with a small, quiet gathering of colleagues who had, by then, become something closer to family, Dr. Pierce, gray-haired himself by then, gave a short speech that surprised everyone with how much it moved him to give it. "There is a version of this hospital," he said, "where I never learned her name, where pride kept me from ever really seeing the people working alongside me. I am endlessly grateful that on one rainy October afternoon, she refused to let me stay that man." Margaret kept working with her hands long after retirement, not in hospitals anymore, but in her own kitchen, rolling out biscuit dough on Sunday mornings for grandchildren who gathered around her table the way she had once, gathered around her own grandmothers, listening to stories about a life spent quietly, faithfully paying attention. And when they asked her, as children always do, what the secret was to a good life. To a life well spent, she would smile the same small, tired, genuine smile she'd given Dr. Pierce all those years before. And she would say the only thing she had ever really known to be true. Decide to help, she'd tell them, flower dust settling soft in the morning light. And your hands will always find a way.